Sarah Mae Thornton had learned to keep her head down and her mouth shut in the small town of Cedar Ridge, Texas. At 26, she carried herself with the hunched shoulders of someone who had been broken too many times to stand tall. The cruel nickname had followed her since high school, whispered behind cupped hands and scrawled on bathroom walls. Monster in the Sack, they called her, though most of the people who used that name had never even spoken to her directly. The nickname had started after one terrible night when she was 17. Bobby Mitchell, the quarterback everyone adored, had taken her to prom after his girlfriend broke up with him 2 days before the dance. Sarah had been so grateful, so hopeful, that someone like Bobby would notice plain, quiet Sarah Mae. She had saved for months to buy a dress, something blue that made her feel almost pretty in the dim lighting of her bedroom mirror. But Bobby had only asked her as a cruel joke, a bet with his friends. After prom, he had spread lies about what happened between them, painting her as desperate and pathetic. The story grew with each telling until Sarah became something monstrous in the minds of her classmates. She became the girl no boy would want to touch, the girl who was so starved for affection that she would embarrass herself trying to get it. The truth was that nothing had happened that night, except humiliation. Bobby had made it clear that being seen with her was charity work, something he regretted before the evening even ended. But the lies stuck to her like tar, and 9 years later, she still felt their weight pressing down on her shoulders every time she walked through town. Sarah worked at Henderson's General Store, stocking shelves and running the register for old Mr. Henderson, who had been kind enough to hire her when no one else would. The job paid barely enough to cover rent on her tiny apartment above the bakery, but it was honest work, and Mr. Henderson treated her with dignity. He never made her feel like she was taking up too much space in the world, which was more than she could say for most people in Cedar Ridge. Her days followed a predictable pattern. She would arrive at the store before sunrise, unlock the doors, and spend her morning arranging merchandise and checking inventory. The early hours were her favorite because the store was empty and peaceful. She could move through the aisles without feeling eyes on her, could hum quietly to herself while she worked. When customers began arriving around 8, she would retreat behind the counter and speak only when spoken to. Most of the town's residents treated her like furniture, something necessary but unremarkable. They would place their purchases on the counter, avoid eye contact, and leave their money without bothering with pleasantries. She preferred it that way. The polite ones were often worse, speaking to her with exaggerated kindness that felt more like pity. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the church ladies' auxiliary, would sometimes stop by with thinly veiled attempts at charity. Sarah Mae, honey, she would say in a voice dripping with false sweetness, you know there are programs that could help a girl like you. Get you some training, maybe help you find a nice young man who could see past your difficulties. These interactions left Sarah feeling scraped raw inside. She knew Mrs. Patterson meant well, in her way, but the woman's idea of help always seemed to involve fixing what was supposedly wrong with Sarah rather than addressing the cruelty of the people around her. The worst part of living in Cedar Ridge was seeing the boys she had grown up with, now men, bringing their wives and girlfriends into the store. They would stand close together, the men's hands possessively on their women's backs, while they picked out supplies for their ranches or homes. Sarah would watch these couples and feel something hollow open up inside her chest. Not jealousy exactly, but a deep longing for that kind of connection, that easy intimacy that seemed to come naturally to everyone but her. Bobby Mitchell still lived in town, having taken over his father's insurance business. He was married now to Jenny Caldwell, a petite blonde who had been homecoming queen a year after Sarah graduated. They had 2 young children and a house on the good side of town with a white picket fence and a tire swing in the yard. Sometimes Bobby would come into the store with his family, and Sarah would have to ring up their purchases while his wife chatted about soccer practice and school fundraisers. Bobby never acknowledged their history. To him, Sarah had become invisible, just another piece of the town's landscape. But sometimes she would catch him looking at her with something that might have been guilt, though it passed so quickly she could never be sure. Those moments were almost worse than the hatred would have been, because they reminded her that he knew the truth about what had happened between them, and he had chosen to let the lies stand. Sarah's only real friend was Margaret Henley, an elderly widow who lived 2 streets over from the store. Margaret had known Sarah's mother before she died, and she seemed to see past the rumors and whispers to the person Sarah actually was. Every Tuesday afternoon, Margaret would stop by the store to buy her groceries, and She would always take a few extra minutes to chat with Sarah about books or the weather or the small dramas of town life. Margaret had a way of talking to Sarah like she was a normal person deserving of respect and genuine conversation. She would ask Sarah's opinion about things, remember details from their previous conversations, and treat her like someone worth knowing. These weekly visits became the bright spot in Sarah's otherwise gray existence. "You remind me of myself at your age," Margaret had told her once while Sarah was bagging her groceries. "I was quiet too, kept to myself. People mistook that for weakness, but I knew better. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who know how to endure." Sarah had carried those words with her for weeks afterward, turning them over in her mind like a smooth stone in her pocket. The idea that her quietness might be a form of strength rather than a character flaw was revolutionary. She had been taught by years of cruel treatment that everything about her was wrong, that she needed to apologize for taking up space in the world. But Margaret's kindness was rare in Cedar Ridge. Most days, Sarah felt like a ghost haunting her own life, moving through familiar routines without really living. She would go home to her small apartment after work and heat up a can of soup for dinner. She would read library books until late into the night, losing herself in stories about people who got to live full lives, people who were loved and wanted and valued. Sometimes she would lie in her narrow bed and wonder what would have happened if she had been born somewhere else, to different parents, with a different face or body or personality. Would she have been the kind of girl who got asked to dance at school functions? Would she have had friends who called her on weekends and invited her to parties? Would some boy have seen something in her worth pursuing? These thoughts always led to a familiar spiral of sadness and self-recrimination. She would remind herself that this kind of thinking was pointless, that she needed to accept her life as it was rather than wasting energy on impossible dreams. She had a roof over her head, food to eat, and work that kept her busy. It was more than some people had, and she should be grateful. But gratitude felt like a heavy coat she had to wear even on hot days. She was tired of being grateful for scraps, tired of convincing herself that loneliness was a reasonable price to pay for safety. She was tired of living like she was serving a sentence for crimes she had never committed. The store's bell chimed, pulling Sarah from her thoughts. She looked up to see Jake Morrison pushing through the door, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. Jake was different from the other men in town, a relative newcomer who had bought the old Peterson ranch 6 months ago and was trying to bring it back to life. He was tall and lean, with calloused hands and laugh lines around his eyes that spoke of a life lived outdoors. Jake nodded to Sarah as he walked past the counter toward the feed and supplies section. He always acknowledged her, always said good morning or afternoon, but he didn't linger to chat. Sarah appreciated this about him. He treated her with the same polite distance he showed everyone else, neither cruel nor overly kind. He seemed like a man who minded his own business and expected others to do the same. She watched him move through the store, noting the careful way he examined each item before making a selection. He was methodical and thorough, quality she respected. When he brought his purchases to the counter, he met her eyes directly and thanked her for her help. These small interactions left Sarah feeling slightly more human than usual, reminded that it was possible for someone to treat her like a person without making a big production of it. After Jake left, Sarah found herself wondering about his story. Where had he come from? What had brought him to Cedar Ridge? Did he have family somewhere who missed him? The questions felt dangerous because they suggested an interest in someone else's life, something she had trained herself not to indulge. But as she went back to stocking shelves, she couldn't shake the image of Jake's weathered hands or the way he had looked directly at her when he said thank you. It was such a small thing, that moment of eye contact, but it felt significant in a life where most people looked through her rather than at her. The afternoon passed slowly, with only a few customers trickling in for odds and ends. Sarah used the quiet time to organize the inventory in the back room, a task that helped calm her mind. There was something soothing about creating order from chaos, about making sure everything had its proper place. As closing time approached, Sarah began her end-of-day routine of sweeping the floors and counting the register. Mr. Henderson had gone home early to attend his grandson's baseball game, leaving Sarah to close up alone. She liked having the store to herself in the evening, liked the way the late afternoon light slanted through the windows and painted everything gold. She was just finishing up when she heard a commotion outside. Through the window, she could see a crowd gathering around something in the street. Sarah hesitated, torn between curiosity and her usual impulse to avoid situations that might draw attention to herself. But the crowd was growing larger, and she could hear shouting and what sounded like an animal in distress. Against her better judgment, Sarah stepped outside to see what was happening. In the middle of the street, a horse was lying on its side, clearly injured. The animal was thrashing weakly, and Sarah could see blood matting its coat. A small crowd of onlookers had gathered, but no one seemed to know what to do. "Someone needs to call the vet," a voice said from the crowd. "Doc Weaver's out of town, visiting his sister," someone else replied. "What about putting it out of its misery?" suggested Bobby Mitchell, who had appeared with his wife and children in tow. "Can't let it suffer like this." The casual way Bobby talked about ending the animal's life made Sarah's stomach turn. She found herself stepping forward before she could think better of it. "Wait," she said, her voice barely loud enough to be heard over the crowd. "Maybe we should try to help it first." Several people turned to look at her, surprise evident on their faces. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she forced herself to continue. "I've read about treating injured horses," she said, though her voice shook with nervousness. "Sometimes what looks fatal isn't as bad as it seems." Bobby laughed, a sound that sent ice through Sarah's veins. "The monster in the sack thinks she's a veterinarian now. That's rich." The nickname hit Sarah like a physical blow, and she felt the familiar urge to disappear, to run back into the store and pretend this had never happened. But the horse was still suffering, and everyone else seemed ready to give up on it. "I could take a look," said a voice from behind her. Sarah turned to see Jake Morrison pushing through the crowd, his face serious and focused. "I've got some experience with injured livestock." Jake knelt beside the horse without waiting for permission from the crowd. His hands moved gently over the animal's body, checking for broken bones and other injuries. The horse had calmed somewhat at his touch, though it was still breathing heavily. "Looks like he got spooked and fell," Jake said, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "Cut himself pretty bad on something sharp, but I don't think anything's broken. If we can get the bleeding stopped and get him somewhere safe, he might make it." "And how exactly do you propose we do that?" Bobby asked, his tone skeptical. "Thing weighs over 1,000 pounds. "My truck's right around the corner," Jake replied. "If I can get him on his feet, I might be able to walk him to my place. I've got a stable where he can rest while we tend to his wounds." Sarah found herself stepping forward again. "I could help," she said quietly. "I mean, if you need someone to assist with the bandaging or whatever." Jake looked at her directly, and she saw something like recognition in his eyes. "I'd appreciate the help," he said simply. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Jake managed to get the horse on its feet, talking to the animal in a low, soothing voice while he guided it slowly down the street toward his ranch. Sarah walked beside them, carrying the first aid supplies Jake had retrieved from his truck. The crowd gradually dispersed, with most people deciding that watching a slow procession of man, woman, and injured horse wasn't worth their time. By the time they reached Jake's property, the sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The ranch was modest but well-maintained, with a small house, a barn, and several pastures enclosed by neat wooden fencing. Jake led the horse into the barn, where Sarah could see he had already prepared a stall with fresh hay. "He's lucky," Jake said as they settled the horse in the stall. "The cut's deep but clean. Should heal up fine with proper care." Sarah watched Jake work, noting the gentle efficiency of his movements as he cleaned and bandaged the horse's wound. The animal stood quietly now, seeming to understand that these humans meant no harm. "You really do know what you're doing," Sarah said softly. Jake glanced up at her, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "My father was a rancher back in Colorado. Taught me that every life has value, whether it's human or animal." Something about the way he said it made Sarah think he wasn't just talking about the horse. She felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in years, something that might have been hope. "Thank you," she said, "for not giving up on him. Most people would have. Most people give up too easily," Jake said, straightening up from his work. "They see something that looks broken and assume it can't be fixed." Their eyes met across the stall, and Sarah felt the weight of years of pain and isolation pressing against her chest. For just a moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it would feel like to be seen as something worth saving, worth the effort it took to heal. "I should probably get back," she said finally, breaking the spell of the moment. "It's getting dark. I could drive you," Jake offered. "It's the least I can do after you helped me tonight." Sarah hesitated, torn between the desire for a few more minutes in this man's presence and the fear of what people might say if they saw her getting out of his truck. In the end, caution won out, as it always did. "That's kind of you, but I don't live far. I can walk." Jake nodded, though she thought she saw disappointment flicker across his face. "Well, thank you again for your help. You were right to speak up back there. That horse is going to make it because you wouldn't let them give up on him." Sarah felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, though she wasn't sure why. She mumbled another goodbye and walked quickly out of the barn, not trusting herself to speak without her voice breaking. As she made her way home through the darkening streets of Cedar Ridge, Sarah found herself replaying every moment of the evening. The way Jake had listened to her suggestion without dismissing it. The way he had included her in caring for the horse. The way he had looked at her like she was someone worth talking to. For the first time in years, Sarah Mae Thornton went to sleep thinking about something other than how much she wished she could disappear. Instead, she found herself wondering what tomorrow might bring, and whether the gentle cowboy with kind eyes might see something in her that everyone else had missed. She didn't yet know that this was only the beginning of a story that would challenge everything she believed about herself, about love, and about the possibility of redemption in a world that had taught her she was unworthy of both. But deep in her heart, something that had been dormant for years was beginning to stir, like the first green shoots pushing through frozen ground at the end of a long, hard winter. The next morning arrived with an unusual energy that Sarah couldn't quite name. She woke earlier than her alarm, sunlight streaming through her small apartment window in a way that made even her shabby furniture look almost cheerful. As she dressed for work, she found herself taking extra care with her appearance, brushing her long brown hair until it shone, and choosing her nicest blouse instead of the faded work shirt she usually wore. She told herself it had nothing to do with the possibility of seeing Jake Morrison again, but the lie felt thin even to her own ears. At the store, Sarah threw herself into her morning routine with renewed purpose. She rearranged the front display twice, organized the candy rack by color, and even hummed softly while she worked. Mr. Henderson, arriving an hour after opening, stopped short when he saw her bustling around the store with unusual animation. "Well, someone's in fine spirits today," he said, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "Did you win the lottery and forget to tell me?" Sarah blushed, realizing how obvious her improved mood must be. "Just feeling good about the day, I suppose," she said, which was true enough. "That's the spirit," Mr. Henderson said, hanging his coat behind the counter. "Life's too short to spend it moping around. Though I've got to say, you've been doing better lately. Standing a little taller, speaking up more. It's good to see." His words surprised Sarah. She hadn't realized that her gradual changes were visible to others, but thinking back over the past few weeks, she could identify small moments where she had felt braver, more willing to engage with the world around her. Maybe it had started before last night, this slow awakening of something inside her that had been sleeping for too long. The morning passed with the usual trickle of customers. Mrs. Henley stopped by with her weekly shopping list and a new book recommendation, talking excitedly about a romance novel she'd just finished. "Sometimes," she said, leaning conspiratorially across the counter, "we need reminding that love stories aren't just for young people or perfect people. They're for anyone brave enough to believe they deserve happiness." Sarah nodded politely, but Mrs. Henley's words lodged themselves in her mind like seeds in fertile ground. The idea that she might deserve happiness was so foreign that it felt almost revolutionary. Around noon, Jake Morrison pushed through the store's front door, carrying a paper bag that smelled deliciously of fresh-baked bread. Sarah's heart jumped in her chest, and she had to grip the counter to keep her hand steady. "Afternoon, Sarah," Jake said, approaching the counter with that easy smile she was beginning to recognize. "I want to thank you again for your help yesterday. That horse is doing much better." "I'm glad to hear it," Sarah replied, proud that her voice came out steady and clear. Jake set the paper bag on the counter. "My neighbor, Mrs. Garcia, heard about what happened and insisted on baking some bread as a thank you. She said anyone who helps an injured animal deserves some of her famous sourdough." Sarah stared at the bag, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of the gesture. When was the last time someone had given her something just to be nice? She couldn't remember. "That's very thoughtful," she managed, "but you really didn't need to." "Of course I did," Jake interrupted gently. "You spoke up when it mattered, and that horse is alive because of it. That's worth celebrating." The word celebrating hit Sarah like a small shock. The idea that her actions might be worth celebrating was so foreign that she almost laughed. But Jake's face was serious, his eyes warm with genuine gratitude. "How is he doing?" Sarah asked, partly to change the subject away from her own discomfort with praise. "Much better. The wound is healing clean, and he's got his appetite back. I've been calling him Lucky, seemed appropriate." Jake leaned against the counter, seeming in no hurry to leave. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about reading about treating injured horses. Where did you learn that?" Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Oh, I read a lot. Medical texts, veterinary guides, whatever the library has. I know it sounds silly, learning about things I'll never use." "Doesn't sound silly at all," Jake said firmly. "Knowledge is never wasted. My grandmother used to say that learning something new every day keeps your mind young and your heart open." There was something about the way Jake spoke, without condescension or surprise at her interests, that made Sarah feel brave enough to continue. "I've always been curious about animals, how they heal, what helps them when they're hurt. When I was little, I used to dream about being a veterinarian, but..." She trailed off, not wanting to voice the familiar refrain of impossibilities that had shaped her adult life. "But what?" Jake prompted gently. Sarah looked down at her hands, twisted together on the counter. "Girls like me don't become veterinarians. We stock shelves and count change and try not to get in anyone's way." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than Sarah had intended. She immediately regretted the honesty, afraid that Jake would respond with pity or platitudes. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "I met a lot of veterinarians in my time, and the best ones weren't necessarily the smartest or the most educated. They were the ones who really cared about the animals, who took the time to learn what they needed to know. Intelligence and compassion can't be taught, but everything else can be learned." Sarah looked up, startled by the conviction in his voice. "You really believe that?" "I do. I've seen too many people accomplish impossible things to believe that anyone's dreams are too big for them." Jake straightened up from the counter. "Matter of fact, if you're really interested in animal care, I could use some help with Lucky and the other horses I'm planning to take in. Nothing official, just someone who cares enough to learn. I'd pay you for your time, of course." Sarah's mouth fell open slightly. The offer was so unexpected, so far beyond what she had imagined possible, that she couldn't immediately process it. "You want me to help with your horses? Why not? You've already proven you know more than most people around here, and you've got the instincts for it. Besides," Jake's smile widened, "Lucky seems to have taken a liking to you. He kept looking toward the barn door after you left, like he was expecting you to come back." The idea of working with horses, of learning something she was genuinely passionate about, made Sarah's heart race with excitement and terror in equal measure. This was the kind of opportunity she had trained herself not to hope for, too good to be real. "I don't know," she said slowly. "What would people say? About me spending time at your ranch, I mean." Jake's expression darkened slightly. "What people say isn't my concern, and it shouldn't be yours either. Life's too short to make decisions based on what small-minded folks might whisper behind their hands." His words were matter-of-fact, but Sarah could hear the steel underneath them. She realized that Jake Morrison was the kind of man who lived by his own code, who didn't bend to social pressure or small-town gossip. The recognition was both admirable and terrifying. "Think about it," Jake said, apparently sensing her internal struggle. "No pressure. The offer stands whenever you're ready." After he left, Sarah found herself unable to concentrate on anything. The bag of sourdough sat on the counter like a tangible reminder of the conversation, filling the store with its warm, yeasty smell. Every few minutes, she would catch herself staring at it and thinking about Jake's words. The afternoon brought its usual collection of customers, but Sarah moved through her interactions like she was sleepwalking. Her mind kept circling back to the image of herself working with horses, learning something that actually mattered to her, being valued for her knowledge and care rather than tolerated despite her existence. Around 4 o'clock, Melissa Crawford swept into the store with her usual air of self-importance. Melissa had been one of the popular girls in high school, and she had married well, securing her position as one of Cedar Ridge's social arbiters. She was the kind of woman who made Sarah feel invisible and grateful for it at the same time. "Sarah May," Melissa said, her voice carrying that particular tone of false friendliness that made Sarah's skin crawl. "I heard you made quite a spectacle of yourself last night." Sarah's stomach dropped, but she forced herself to meet Melissa's eyes. "I help with an injured horse. I wouldn't call that a spectacle." Melissa laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, honey, That's not what I heard. Bobby Mitchell told everyone how you tried to play veterinarian in front of half the town. Said it was embarrassing to watch. The familiar shame began its slow burn in Sarah's chest, but something else rose alongside it. Anger, clean and bright and surprisingly strong. Though, I have to say, it's interesting how quickly you attached yourself to the new man in town. Desperate times call for desperate measures, I suppose. The implication in Melissa's words was clear, and Sarah felt the old wounds threatening to reopen. But then she remembered Jake's face when he'd offered her the job, the genuine respect in his voice when he'd talked about her knowledge and instincts. I think you've misunderstood the situation, Sarah said, her voice steadier than she felt. But thank you for your concern. Melissa's eyes narrowed, clearly not expecting such a measured response. Well, she said, selecting a pack of gum from the counter display. Just be careful, Sarah May. Men like Jake Morrison don't stay in places like this for long, and when they leave, they don't usually take the local charity cases with them. After Melissa left, Sarah stood behind the counter, shaking with suppressed emotion. The encounter had reminded her of all the reasons she had learned to make herself small, to avoid drawing attention or taking risks. The town's judgment was swift and harsh, and she had been on the receiving end of it for too long to pretend it didn't hurt. But underneath the familiar pain, something new was stirring. For the first time in years, Sarah found herself angry rather than ashamed. Angry at the way people like Melissa felt entitled to police her life. Angry at the way they reduced every interaction to gossip and speculation. Angry at herself for caring so much about the opinions of people who had never shown her an ounce of kindness. That evening, Sarah walked home with Jake's offer weighing heavy on her mind. Her small apartment felt especially cramped after spending the day thinking about wide open spaces and fresh air and animals who didn't judge her for her past mistakes. She heated up a can of soup for dinner and tried to lose herself in a book, but the words swam before her eyes. Finally, she gave up pretending to read and allowed herself to really consider what Jake was proposing. Working with horses would mean leaving the safety of the general store, stepping outside the narrow boundaries she had built around her life. It would mean trusting someone who barely knew her, believing that her interests and instincts might actually be worth something. But it would also mean facing the town's gossip mill head-on, giving people like Melissa and Bobby even more ammunition for their cruel observations. It would mean risking the fragile stability she had built for herself in exchange for something uncertain and potentially wonderful. Sarah walked to her small window and looked out at the darkening town below. Cedar Ridge spread out before her like a collection of tiny lights, each one representing a life that seemed fuller and more connected than her own. For years, she had looked at those lights with envy and resignation, accepting that she would always be on the outside looking in. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, she found herself wondering what her life might look like if she stopped making decisions based on fear. What if she chose courage over safety, possibility over certainty? What if she took Jake's offer and discovered that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined? The questions scared her, but they also thrilled her in a way she hadn't experienced since childhood. For the first time in years, Sarah May Thornton went to bed thinking about tomorrow not as something to endure, but as something to anticipate. She didn't sleep well, her dreams filled with horses and wide open spaces and a man with kind eyes who saw something in her worth believing in. When she woke the next morning, she knew what her answer would be. The decision felt terrifying and liberating in equal measure, like stepping off a cliff and trusting that she might actually fly rather than fall. But as she dressed for work, Sarah realized that falling might not be the worst thing that could happen to her. Living the rest of her life wondering what if would be far worse. By the time she reached the general store, her mind was made up. When Jake Morrison walked through that door again, she would be ready with her answer. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Sarah May Thornton was looking forward to taking a leap of faith. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she unlocked the front door of Henderson's general store the next morning. She had barely slept, her mind cycling through endless variations of the conversation she planned to have with Jake Morrison. Would he still want her help? Had he been serious about the offer, or was it just politeness in the aftermath of saving Lucky? The questions plagued her, but underneath the nervousness was a steel resolve she hadn't felt in years. Mr. Henderson arrived shortly after 8, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee from May's diner down the street. "Thought you might need this," he said, offering her one of the cups. "You look like you've got something weighing on your mind." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, warming her hands on the ceramic mug. "Mr. Henderson, can I ask you something?" "Of course you can, child. What's troubling you?" Sarah took a deep breath. "If someone offered you a chance to do something you'd always wanted to do, but it meant leaving behind everything safe and familiar, would you take it?" Mr. Henderson studied her face carefully, his wise old eyes taking in details she hadn't realized she was showing. "That depends," he said finally. "Is this something that's likely to make you happy?" "I think so. Maybe. I'm not sure I remember what happy feels like anymore." Her honesty surprised them both. Mr. Henderson set down his coffee and leaned against the counter, giving her his full attention. "Sarah May, I've watched you work here for 3 years now, and you're one of the finest people I know. Honest, hardworking, kind to customers who don't deserve it. But you've been carrying yourself like you're apologizing for taking up space in the world, and that breaks my heart." Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. "People in this town have made it pretty clear what they think of me." "People in this town don't know you," Mr. Henderson said firmly. "They know stories and rumors and their own small-minded prejudices. But I know the real you, and the real you deserves every good thing this world has to offer." The conviction in his voice made Sarah's chest tight with emotion. "What if I fail? What if I try something new and I'm terrible at it?" "Then you'll have tried," Mr. Henderson said with a gentle smile. "And that's more than most people can say. Sarah May, you've spent enough years playing it safe. Maybe it's time to take a chance on yourself." His words were still echoing in Sarah's mind when Jake Morrison walked through the front door around 10:30. He was dressed in work clothes, his boots dusty from ranch work, and he carried himself with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in his own skin. When he saw Sarah behind the counter, his face lit up with a genuine smile that made her stomach flutter. "Morning, Sarah," he said, approaching the counter. "How are you today?" "I'm good," she replied, and was surprised to realize it was true. "Actually, I'm better than good. I've been thinking about your offer." Jake's expression became more attentive, his eyes searching her face. And Sarah took a deep breath, feeling like she was standing at the edge of a precipice. "I'd like to accept, if you still want me, that is. I'd like to learn about caring for horses." Jake's smile widened until it transformed his entire face. "That's wonderful news. When can you start?" "Well, I work here until 6 most days, but I could come by afterward if that's not too late." "Perfect. We'll start this evening if you're up for it. I'll show you around the property, introduce you to Lucky properly, and we can talk about what needs doing." The simple matter-of-fact way Jake discussed their arrangement made it feel real and possible rather than like an impossible dream. Sarah found herself smiling back, feeling lighter than she had in years. "There is one thing," Jake said, his expression growing more serious. "I want you to know that this isn't charity. I really do need help with the horses, and I think you'll be good at it. This is a job offer, not a favor." His words addressed a fear Sarah hadn't even realized she was carrying. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means more than you know." After Jake left, promising to see her that evening, Sarah found herself moving through the rest of her workday with unusual energy. Even the typically draining interactions with difficult customers couldn't dampen her spirits. When Mrs. Patterson came in with her usual combination of gossip and thinly veiled criticism, Sarah found herself responding with polite indifference rather than her usual anxious people-pleasing. "I hear you've been making quite an impression on our new rancher, Mrs. Patterson said while examining a display of canned goods with exaggerated interest. "Jake Morrison seems like a nice man," Sarah replied neutrally, not taking the bait. "Oh, he is. Very handsome, too. Though I do wonder what a successful man like that wants with." Mrs. Patterson's voice trailed off meaningfully. Sarah felt the familiar clench of shame in her stomach, but this time it was accompanied by something stronger. Anger, clean and bright, rose in her chest. "With what, Mrs. Patterson?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion inside her. Mrs. Patterson looked startled by the direct question. "Well, I just meant, you know how men can be. Sometimes they take advantage of lonely women who might be grateful for any attention." The implication stung, but Sarah refused to let it show. "I appreciate your concern, but I can take care of myself." After Mrs. Patterson left, clearly disappointed by Sarah's lack of dramatic reaction, Mr. Henderson emerged from the back room where he had been pretending to organize inventory. Good for you, he said simply. It's about time you started standing up for yourself. As 6 o'clock approached, Sarah found herself growing nervous again. This was really happening. She was about to step outside the narrow confines of her safe, predictable life and try something new. The possibility of failure loomed large, but so did the possibility of discovery, of finding out what she might be capable of when given the chance. She said goodbye to Mr. Henderson and walked the familiar streets toward Jake's ranch. The evening was pleasant, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers and fresh grass. As she approached the ranch entrance, Sarah could see Jake waiting for her by the main gate, and her heart did a little skip in her chest. Right on time, Jake said as she approached. Ready for the grand tour? Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Jake led her through the gate and began pointing out the various features of his property. The ranch was bigger than it had appeared from the road, with several pastures, a large barn, a smaller stable, and what looked like the beginnings of an arena for training horses. I'm planning to turn this into a rescue operation, Jake explained as they walked. There are a lot of horses in this area that need homes, whether they're injured strays like Lucky or animals whose owners can't care for them anymore. The passion in his voice was evident, and Sarah found herself caught up in his vision. That sounds wonderful. How many horses are you hoping to take in? As many as I can properly care for. That's where you come in. One person can only do so much, but with help, we can make a real difference. They reached the barn where Lucky was housed, and Sarah felt a thrill of recognition when the horse lifted his head and nickered softly at her approach. His wound had healed remarkably well, leaving only a faint scar on his flank. He remembers you, Jake said, sounding pleased. Horses have good memories for people who show them kindness. Sarah approached Lucky's stall slowly, extending her hand for him to sniff before gently stroking his neck. The horse leaned into her touch, and she felt a connection form between them that was unlike anything she had experienced with another living creature. He's beautiful, she whispered. He is now, Jake agreed. But when we found him, he was half dead and had obviously been mistreated. It takes patience and consistency to help an animal like that learn to trust again. Something about the way Jake spoke about helping damaged creatures learn to trust made Sarah wonder if he understood more about her own situation than he let on. The thought was both comforting and terrifying. Jake spent the next hour showing Sarah the basics of horse care, explaining how to check for injuries, how to read an animal's body language, and how to approach horses safely. Sarah absorbed every word, asking questions and taking mental notes. She had read about these things, but experiencing them firsthand was entirely different. You're a natural, Jake said as Sarah successfully got another horse, a gentle mare named Daisy, to accept a halter. Look how calm she is with you. Animals can sense when someone genuinely cares about them. The praise made Sarah glow inside, but she tried not to let it go to her head. I just want to do right by them. That's exactly the attitude that makes a good caregiver, Jake said. Knowledge can be learned, but genuine compassion can't be taught. As they worked together in the fading light, Sarah found herself relaxing in a way she hadn't in years. There was something about being around the horses that quieted the constant anxiety that usually hummed beneath the surface of her consciousness. The animals didn't care about her past, didn't judge her for the mistakes she had or had made. They responded only to how she treated them in the present moment. This is nice, she said without thinking, then immediately blushed at her own boldness. Jake looked at her with that gentle smile she was coming to treasure. It is nice. I've been working alone for months, and it's good to have someone to share this with. As they finished up the evening feeding routine, Jake walked Sarah toward the ranch entrance. The sun had set while they worked, and stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Same time tomorrow? Jake asked. Yes, Sarah replied without hesitation. I'll be here. But as she walked back toward town, Sarah's euphoria began to fade, replaced by the familiar anxiety about what people would say. She had been gone from her usual routines for several hours, and in a town the size of Cedar Ridge, that wouldn't go unnoticed. Sure enough, as she reached Main Street, she saw several people she recognized standing outside May's diner, and their conversation stopped abruptly when they spotted her. Sarah forced herself to walk normally, to not hurry or try to hide. She had done nothing wrong. She was learning a skill, helping animals, trying to build a better life for herself. If people wanted to make that into something ugly, that said more about them than about her. But The whispers started before she even reached her apartment. By the time she climbed the stairs to her small rooms above the bakery, Sarah could feel the weight of speculation and judgment pressing down on her shoulders like a familiar burden. She had just settled in with a cup of tea and a book when someone knocked on her door. Sarah's heart sank, assuming it was her landlord with a complaint or perhaps Mrs. Patterson with more unsolicited advice. Instead, she opened the door to find Margaret Henley standing in the hallway, holding a covered casserole dish. "Margaret," Sarah said, surprised. "What are you doing here?" "Brought you some dinner," the older woman said, pushing past Sarah into the small living room. "Figured you might not have had time to cook, what with your new job and all." Sarah closed the door, wondering how Margaret had already heard about her arrangement with Jake. "You know about that?" Margaret set the casserole dish on Sarah's small dining table and turned to face her with a knowing smile. "Honey, I've lived in this town for 73 years. I know everything that happens here before it happens." "And what exactly do you know?" Sarah asked cautiously. "I know that Jake Morrison offered you work helping with his horses, and you were smart enough to accept. I know that you spent this evening learning things you've wanted to learn for years, and I know that you came home tonight happier than I've seen you since your mother died." Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes at Margaret's matter-of-fact acceptance of her choices. "You don't think I'm being foolish?" "I think you're being brave," Margaret said firmly. "And it's about damn time." The unexpected profanity from the dignified older woman made Sarah laugh despite her emotional state. "What do you think people will say?" "I think people will say exactly what they always say when someone they've written off does something unexpected. They'll gossip and speculate and try to tear you down because your success makes them uncomfortable with their own choices." Margaret moved closer, taking Sarah's hands in her weathered ones. "But, Sarah May, you can't live your life according to the limitations other people want to put on you. You're 26 years old. You have decades ahead of you. Do you want to spend them hiding behind that counter? Or do you want to find out what you're really capable of?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and challenge. Sarah realized that Margaret was offering her the same thing Jake had, in her own way. Permission to be more than what people expected, to reach for something better. "I want to find out what I'm capable of," Sarah said quietly. "Then, don't let the small minds of small people stop you," Margaret said. "You've got something special, child. Always have. Maybe it's time the rest of the world got to see it too." After Margaret left, Sarah sat in her quiet apartment thinking about the day's events. Two people had now seen something in her worth investing in, worth believing in. The recognition was both thrilling and overwhelming. For so many years, she had accepted the town's assessment of her worth that she had almost forgotten she might be capable of more. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Sarah May Thornton fell asleep planning for tomorrow rather than dreading it. In her dreams, she was surrounded by horses and wide open spaces, and someone was calling her name with respect and warmth rather than mockery or condescension. The future was still uncertain, still fraught with challenges and obstacles she couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time in her adult life, the uncertainty felt like possibility rather than threat. And that, Sarah realized as she drifted off to sleep, was a kind of miracle all by itself. 3 weeks in her new routine, Sarah had established a rhythm that felt both foreign and natural. Her days at Henderson's General Store passed with new energy, each hour bringing her closer to the evening when she could walk to Jake's ranch and lose herself in the world of horses and open sky. She had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when an animal was uncomfortable or in pain, to mix feed rations, and to assist with basic veterinary procedures. More importantly, she had begun to trust herself in ways she never had before. The change hadn't gone unnoticed in town. Sarah could feel eyes on her as she walked through the streets, could hear conversations that stopped abruptly when she passed. The attention made her uncomfortable, but she refused to let it drive her back into hiding. She had tasted possibility, and nothing could make her willingly return to her previous prison of self-imposed limitations. On this particular evening, Sarah arrived at the ranch to find Jake standing in the main pasture with a horse she hadn't seen before. The animal was clearly agitated, pacing and tossing its head, with wounds on its legs that spoke of recent mistreatment. Jake was standing perfectly still about 10 feet away, simply allowing the horse to become accustomed to his presence. "New arrival?" Sarah asked quietly as she approached. "Found him this morning tied to my front gate. Jake said without taking his eyes off the horse. Someone drop him off in the night. He's been abused. That much is obvious. Going to take time to earn his trust. Sarah studied the horse, noting the way it held its injured leg and the fearful way it watched Jake's every movement. What's his story? Near as I can tell, he belonged to Tom Garrett out east of town. Tom's been drinking heavy since his wife left him, and word is he's been taking his anger out on anything that can't fight back. Jake's voice carried a hard edge that Sarah had never heard before. Sheriff won't do anything about it. Says it's a civil matter. The injustice of the situation made Sarah's chest tight with anger. So this poor animal just has to suffer because his owner is a drunk? Not anymore, Jake said firmly. I may not be able to prove Tom was abusing him, but I can make sure this horse gets the care he deserves.